Hi, I'm Paul J. Welcome to theAnalysis.news. Please don't forget, without your financial support, moral support, sharing social media support, we can't do this. I'll be back in just a few seconds with Yves Engler. We're going to talk about the self-righteous Canadians. Canadian governments like to portray themselves as the peacekeepers, the more reasonable country that tries to mitigate the excesses of American society and its military machine. Of course, Canada pitches in troops when necessary, but only when it seems like a just and legal war, or so goes the self-serving and self-righteous narrative. Well, Yves Engler has written a new book that exposes the true North's role in serving and making massive profits from the U.S. military-industrial complex. The book is titled Stand on Guard for Whom? A People's History of the Canadian Military. In the Canadian national anthem, O Canada, the phrase, "We stand on guard for thee," is repeated 3 times in 4 stanzas. Just who we stand on guard for is never made clear. But when the first version of the anthem was written in 1880, the main threat to stand on guard from was coming from the South. That said, a 1908 version made Canada's military role clear at the time. Quote, "At Britain's side, whate'er betide, unflinchingly we will stand. With hearts we sing, God save the King. Guide then one empire wide, do we implore." Canadian elites and military have always found it profitable to support empire. And with the coming to power of Prime Minister Lester Pearson, Canada became a full-fledged junior partner of the American global hegemony. In fact, it was President Kennedy that helped put Pearson in power in the first place, in a flagrant manipulation of a Canadian election. More on that later. None of what follows is meant to denigrate the courage and self-sacrifice of thousands of Canadians who served in the Canadian Armed Forces. My father was one of them, flying as a navigator for the RCAF from 1939 to 1945 in some of the most dangerous missions of the war. It was typical of the Canadian government in World War I and World War II to allow Canucks to be fodder in what amounted to suicidal missions, and often pointless ones. My father consciously volunteered to join the Air Force in order to fight Hitlerite fascism, but he never had any illusions about Canada's role in supporting fascism in the lead up to the war, including, as Yves writes in his book, quote, "Canada largely sided with the fascists during the Spanish Civil War. Ottawa refused repeated requests from Spain's elected government to sell it weaponry. In April 1937, Ottawa passed the Foreign Enlistment Act in a bid to block Canadians from fighting on behalf of the Republican government," end quote. That is, fighting against the dictator Franco, who was supported by Hitler and Mussolini. My father's brother volunteered and made it to Spain, in spite of attempts by the Canadian government to obstruct the members of the MacPap Battalion. Yves writes further down, "During this period, Canada found no fault in supplying war materials to the fascist Japanese army that occupied Korea and massacred the Chinese in Manchuria. In the years leading up to the start of the European front of World War II, Japan was the 3rd largest importer of Canadian non-ferrous metals." Every year on Remembrance Day, Canadian children are taught to recite a poem written by a Montreal doctor, John McCrae, in 1915, after thousands of Canadians were slaughtered in Ypres, Belgium. The poem begins, "In Flanders fields the poppies blow." It ends with a call to arms. "Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw the torch. Be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow in Flanders fields." I think it'd be better if kids are taught to read a piece by another Montreal doctor, Norman Bethune, who volunteered to go to Spain and China to fight against fascism. In 1939, he wrote, Are wars of aggression, wars for conquest of colonies, then just big business? Yes, it would seem so. However much the perpetrators of such national crimes seek to hide their true purpose under banners of high-sounding abstractions and ideals. They make war to capture markets by murder, raw materials by rape. They find it cheaper to steal than to exchange, easier to butcher than to buy. Bethune continues, behind all stands that terrible, implacable god of business and blood, whose name is profit. Money is like an insatiable Moloch, demanding its interest, its return, and will stop at nothing, at not even murder of millions, to satisfy its greed. Behind the army stands the militarists. Behind the militarists stands finance, capital, and the capitalist. Brothers in blood, companions in crime. Bethune ends with, such an organization of human society as permits them to exist must be abolished. These men make the wounds. As much as Canadians like to think we're better than that, the real history shows we're not. Now joining us to discuss his new book, Stand on Guard for Whom, is Yves Engler. Yves is a Montreal-based activist and author. He's published 11 books, including House of Mirrors, Justin Trudeau's Foreign Policy. Thanks for joining us, Yves.
Thanks for having me.
So you trace quite a bit of history in the book. I'm going to kind of jump ahead and in future interviews pick up some of the other pieces of history. But as people that watch the analysis know, I'm working with Ellsberg on a film about nuclear weapons. So I jumped right to your chapter about Canada's role in developing the apocalyptic weapons. So start with the history of Canada and nuclear weapons. I guess it starts with uranium.
Yeah, Canadian uranium was used in the U.S. Nuclear weapons program, and ultimately the bombs dropped on Japan, which in fact in the late 1990s, the Dene people, who the uranium was taken from their land with little of their own control over, they actually apologized to the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki for the bombs being dropped. But Canadian government spent huge amounts of money researching nuclear weapons during World War II, coordinating with the British and the Americans. The British nuclear weapons program actually moved to Canada for safety reasons during World War II. And Canadian officials were signatories to the Quebec Agreement between the US and the British around nuclear weapons development. And Canadian officials were aware that the nuclear weapons were going to be dropped on Japan. So there's a history of Canadian support for nuclear weapons. Prime Minister, after the Hiroshima and Nagasaki are bombed, says that he's in his diary says that he's happy that this took place on the Asian races versus the European races, reflecting a certain kind of racism. But I think that the Canadian involvement in nuclear weapons production, and then Canadian military having nuclear weapons in future years, is really kind of reflective of how Canada was very close to the British Empire. The Canadian military very close to the British Empire, and then during World War II became very close to the U.S. military. So it's sort of an outgrowth of Canada's kind of unique history of close ties to the two great military empires of the past couple hundred years.
As the American economic investment, power, control of Canada grew, even before the First World War, a lot of the railroad expansion in Canada was actually American capital. And between the wars, the Americans increased their position enormously. Off the top of my head, I believe by the Second World War had overtaken British investment. But Prime Minister Diefenbaker, who was in power in the late 50s and early 60s, he was still playing this sort of positioning of trying to play off the Americans and British to some extent, having a certain independence from the U.S. which pissed the hell out of Kennedy. And it came to a head over a couple of issues which directly connected with nuclear weapons. Tell us that story.
Yeah, well, in the October 1962 blockade Cuban Missile Crisis, the Diefenbaker government was unwilling to just accept U.S. position. Most importantly, putting NORAD on high alert, uh, and that angered the U.S. And so basically, Diefenbaker and the foreign minister were not happy to just go along with the U.S. position. In fact, Canadian naval vessels, without any political directive, did in fact support the U.S. Blockade of Cuba. But basically, the main thing that Kennedy wanted, which was the NORAD high alert and the full political subservience, they didn't do. And and basically, the head of the Canadian naval at the base in Halifax. Actually deployed Canadian naval vessels, acted like they were part of a training mission, but in fact they were just supporting the U.S. without having any piece of paper or any directive to do so. He basically broke the proper civilian military command structure. But
Well, let me interrupt. There was proper military civilian command structure. Just the civilian command structure was in Washington, not Ottawa.
yeah, no, exactly. And it's actually totally surreal to read some military historians. Like Jack Granatstein points out, this is the worst breaking of the proper command structure in Canadian military history. Notes this is a very pro-military historian, but there's actually a number of military historians that I quote in the book that actually act like this was a good thing, that the naval commander just ignored the political directive and just followed the political directive from Washington versus what he the people who are supposed to be the.
And let me add one other note. It's Pierre Trudeau, the current Trudeau's father, when he was prime minister. He gets all the credit for Canada maintaining a sort of independent policy on relations with Cuba. But actually, it's not true. It was Diefenbaker that established that and defied the Americans and maintained normal diplomatic and trade relations with Cuba.
Yeah,
But go on with the story.
yeah. So, but there's actually more to that story as well. But the result of Diefenbaker's position on the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I think more generally, there was a Diefenbaker. It should be noted that he wins the election in part criticizing Lester Pearson, then as Foreign Affairs Minister, his role in the Suez Crisis. Right, so the British, the French, and Israelis invade Egypt in 1956, and the famous peacekeeping mission that Lester Pearson comes up with was done in conjunction with John Foster Dulles, and it was a way the Americans opposed the British, French, Israeli invasion, and it was the peacekeeping mission was a way to basically help the British out of this disastrous invasion, but it was the clear diplomatic break of Canada being tied to the British Empire and then being tied to the American Empire.
Okay, let me just add another fast note because we have a lot of American viewers. So Diefenbaker was the head of the Conservative Party. He had maintained more relations with the British, and Pearson became the head of the Liberal Party. And Pearson and the Suez Crisis, as you mentioned, is an example of how much Pearson was allied with the Americans.
Exactly. So this is part of the background to Kennedy being closer to Pearson and hostile to Diefenbaker, and what happened with Cuba just amped up that longer history of tension or political disagreement. And then Kennedy helps basically have the Diefenbaker government collapse in early 1963, and there's a series of parts to that, and everything from leaking all kinds of negative press reports in the U.S. media around Diefenbaker, U.S. officials repeatedly calling Diefenbaker a liar. The head of NATO comes to Ottawa in early 1963 to basically say that Diefenbaker is refusing to take Bomarc missiles is undermining Canada's role in NATO alliance. So there's a whole series of measures that Kennedy pursues to precipitate the fall of the Diefenbaker government. And then when that happens, then there's a series of measures to support Pearson during the 1963 election. The most important one is his pollster Lou Harris is sent to
His meaning Kennedy's.
Kennedy's pollster is sent to support the Liberal government or the Liberal Party, Pearson, during that election. And previously the Labour Party in Britain had asked to have Lou Harris support them. That was refused, but then it was granted to Pearson. There's other claims that the Diefenbaker and other conservative officials claim that the CIA actually was involved in throughout the election campaign and sort of undermining their campaign. Some of that's never really been fully.
But one of the things that is, I believe, now factually proved is that Kennedy, and I don't know if it's through the CIA or not, but he arranged for Lou Harris, the pollster, to get a phony passport under a false name, and go to Ottawa. My old colleague who helped me create this TV show, Counterspin, he says it was a standing joke amongst journalists at the time of that election that Pearson's campaign was being run by Lou Harris out of the basement of the U.S. Embassy, literally out of the U.S. Embassy. And he brought all these modern polling methods and to help message and create Pearson's campaign and defeat Diefenbaker. But let's talk a little bit more about that Bomarc missile issue, because that's a big deal. Kennedy wanted nuclear-armed Bomarc missiles on Canadian territory as part of this SAGE radar system. Was supposed to shoot down Soviet bombers when they come in. But Diefenbaker said no, partly because, if I understand it correctly, he said it would just make Canada a target. Is that right?
Yeah, he was making Canada a target, and I think that it was also there was a certain degree of ambivalence towards nuclear weapons, of course, and also Diefenbaker had been ambivalent towards NORAD, which is set up in 1958, and it's the negotiations for that begin earlier, before he becomes prime minister, and it's viewed that the military basically forced Diefenbaker into agreeing to NORAD. I believe it's initially signed in 1957 and comes into effect in 58, and the military basically forced it upon Diefenbaker. And the Bomarc missiles, which were stationed, I believe, mostly in North Bay, Ontario. I think there were some in Quebec as well. Effectively, they were under the control of the NORAD headquarters in Colorado, obviously. So basically, effectively under U.S. Not effectively, were under U.S. Military control, with Canadians that are part of the NORAD command structure as well. There was ambivalence around that question, and I think it just fit within a kind of more general questioning of U.S. Military power. Now, I'm kind of a little bit ambivalent around Diefenbaker, because he was somebody who was supportive of the British Empire, and it's not like the British military and the British Empire was some sort of democratic or humanitarian force. So it's a kind of a battle between two different political outlooks that I don't really agree with. But certainly the extent to which Kennedy and the U.S. played a role in precipitating Diefenbaker government's fall, but also Pearson's rise, is one that's a pretty scandalous story. And just one little anecdote in this: Pearson himself tells the story, just the extent to which Kennedy was sort of intervening. He tells the story about how Kennedy wanted to meet him in person during this period, when he was the head of the opposition in 1962, end of 1962. That he asks to have a justification for Pearson to go down to Boston. He asks Pearson if he has a honorary degree from Harvard. Pearson already has an honorary degree from Harvard. He says, "Do you have an honorary degree from Boston College?" I think Pearson already had an honorary degree from Boston College. Then he says, "How about BU, Boston University?" And he comes up Kennedy orchestrates getting Pearson an honorary degree from Boston University to have a reason for Pearson to go down, and then to have private meetings with Kennedy on the side.
Because he's not the prime minister, he's leader of the opposition, and it wouldn't be appropriate otherwise.
And he was already there's already criticism of Pearson as being sort of a U.S. stooge and being really close to Kennedy and to Washington. So to have this other rationale, and also obviously that would also add to Pearson's kind of media aura that he gets lots of honorary degrees from prestigious institutions. But that just gives you a sense of how much Pearson and I did a whole book about Pearson, but Pearson had really been aligned with the U.S. going back to during World War II and right after World War II on questions from the partition plan on Palestine to the Korean War to supporting the ouster of Arbenz in Guatemala, et cetera, et cetera.
Let me just add a couple of notes to this. Of course, I agree with you about the British Empire, which has plenty of blood on its hands. But the extent to which Diefenbaker still maintained a certain amount of, if you can call it independence, dependence on Britain rather than total dependence on the United States, the Pearson election was really a watershed where from then on, both parties, conservative and liberals, became complete junior partner supplicants of the United States. And Diefenbaker was thrown out, overthrown within the Conservative Party. But it's an important watershed moment in Canadian politics and Canadian history. And this Bomarc missile thing, a lot of it was used to defeat Diefenbaker, not just because Kennedy wanted Bomarc missiles in Canada, but there was a lot of Cold War hysteria in Canada. So to look weak on fighting communism and fighting the Soviet Union and all that, that was also meant to help Pearson. And in fact, as I understand it now from talking to Ellsberg and others like Lester Ernest, who worked on the SAGE radar program, which is the one that controlled these missiles. The SAGE radar was supposed to detect the Soviet planes, and then the missiles would be guided by computers to go hit them, which in itself was insane because over Canadian territory, you would have nuclear Soviet bombers hit by nuclear weapons over Canadian territory. And that's what they wanted Diefenbaker to agree to. 2 nuclear blasts over Canada. The whole thing was bloody insane. The only other part to it is SAGE never worked. If people that watch my interviews with Lester Ernest, the whole thing was bullshit. They had never solved the problem of radar jamming. And so they spent $1 trillion over 25 years on this MIT thing. And it was just a boondoggle that a lot of MIT and a bunch of contractors made money out of and wouldn't have worked for 1 minute. And Kennedy knew it, but he needed to rub Diefenbaker's nose in this Bomarc missile thing. They wanted to establish the principle or precedent of nuclear weapons on Canadian soil. And he just didn't damn well like that Diefenbaker had said no. And apparently they also wanted Canada to have, in Europe, that Canadian forces should have some nuclear weapons. And apparently Diefenbaker didn't agree with that either. So there was an anti-nuclear thing in fact, in that sense, there were sections in Washington that sort of agreed with him, but not dominant. Anyway, let's move on. But just to sum all this up, essentially, United States carries out a regime change in Canada in order to assert its full power over the Canadian foreign policy and certainly military policy. But that ain't all. Let's go on. Should we go on to can-do reactors at this point?
Yeah. So in the book, I suggest that after the 9 countries that have nuclear weapons, Canada is kind of next in line as playing the biggest role in nuclear proliferation. And one element of that is the exporting of CANDU reactors, nuclear reactors, to at least a half dozen countries. India uses the Cyrus reactor to to develop its nuclear weapons. And part of the reason they choose the Canadian is because there was very weak safeguards in the agreement. Then Pakistan, of course, responds and also uses Canadian reactors, Candu reactor that exported to Pakistan. Pakistan then uses the exports Canada already made to them to develop nuclear weapons. So the Canadian government, the Canadian government is even involved in in nuclear cooperation with the apartheid, South African apartheid white regime until fairly late in the apartheid game. So the Canadian government has been, heavily involved. There's this uranium exports, huge amounts of uranium exports to the U.S. over many decades. For a long period, it was after World War II. It was, I think, the fourth biggest Canadian export uranium. So the Canadian government has this history of being unconcerned about nuclear proliferation. Also, the Canadian military wanted Canada to acquire nuclear weapons and put forward numerous proposals over the years, explicitly lobbying for Canada to acquire nuclear weapons. Because they wanted to be, part of the big boys, if you like. And so the Canadian government, and then also through NATO, right? Canada has supported NATO nuclear weapons that goes up right up until today, and has opposed efforts to rid the world of these abhorrent mass killers.
Let's go back to India and Pakistan for a minute, because it may be that there is actually no more immediate danger to the world than a potential nuclear conflict between India and Pakistan. You've got in Pakistan, you have a military that essentially runs the government. And that military is highly, highly infiltrated by Al Qaeda and various other Islamic extremists. A lot of fanatical religion within the Pakistan military, up to very senior levels. And then you have Hindu nationalist fascists in power in New Delhi. You have two sides of the equation of an extremely tense situation. Both nuclear armed countries, both where things could easily get out of hand, where there's outbreaks of actual fighting over Kashmir every so often. Extremely dangerous situation. And Canada had a lot to do with providing the reactors that kicked this whole thing off. If these countries went to nuclear war, it wouldn't just devastate the millions and millions of people in such, all throughout this part of the world. It would also create a kind of minor nuclear winter. And then the other thing that's in the works right now is there's some pressure building in the United States. And by the way, let me say, there's a lot of religious fanaticism within the American military. I don't think anyone can let that go unsaid when you're talking about religious fanaticism in a military. But there's a lot of pressure building to end the test ban treaty. And apparently, if the nuclear test ban treaty ends, it's going to quickly speed up the development of an H-bomb in India and Pakistan. And if they were ever to go to war with H-bombs rather than the older atomic bombs, that is apparently, according to a lot of the scientists that study climate change and nuclear winter, enough to create a global nuclear winter, which means essentially, the end of most human civilization. So, am I correct that it wasn't unknown to Canada when they sold these reactors that they would probably be weaponized, even though Pakistan and India claimed they wouldn't?
I'm not sure about that, but what I am sure about is that the Canadian government, in the agreements, was very lax on, specifically with the Cyrus, to India, on the what they could do with it, and the Indians chose the Canadian technology to, because of precisely for that reason. After India tested its first nuclear weapon, the Canadian government brought in restrictions on any exports to India. But in fact, about a decade ago, the Harper government, when they really sort of recharged relations with India, which was partly about sort of concern around China, they restarted the nuclear exports, and I believe there were even officials, if I remember correctly, there were even officials from Can-Do that came on the trade mission with Harper to, I guess it was probably to New Delhi, and it was a little bit controversial at the time that the Harper government was changing some of the restrictions. So yeah, I mean, the Canadian government has a certain degree of ambivalence, and they have hostility towards things like the TPNW, the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and that's, the Trudeau government, when there was the initial UN in I believe it's late 2016 discussions about holding a conference to try to come forward with an agreement to work towards banning nuclear weapons. The Trudeau government voted against it. Then Trudeau himself mocked it when they held a conference, and about 2/3 of the world's countries attended. Canada didn't attend. And then when the treaty was signed, Canada has refused to sign, and then it was finally it hit I think 50 signatures, 50 countries signing. So it came into effect in January of this year. Continued the Canadian government continued to oppose it, and kind of amazingly throughout this whole thing, they say they want to rid the world of nuclear weapons, right? So they have like quite good rhetoric on nuclear weapons, but they are unwilling to sign this landmark international treaty to try to move towards abolishing nuclear weapons. And I think that kind of fits with their their stuff on concern around India and Pakistan potentially going to getting in a nuclear war. Is that they're more concerned with their NATO alliance, and they're more concerned with the Canadian companies that are involved, like SNC-Lavalin and others that are involved in nuclear exports, than they are with the existential threat that that nuclear war poses to humanity.
I just add one quick note on Pakistan. It was the Reagan government that also facilitated, or looked the other way at the very least, as Pakistan developed its bomb, even though I believe there'd been a law passed in Congress banning any support for a Pakistani bomb. When Pakistan collaborated with Reagan in arms shipments to Afghanistan, that Reagan agreed to let the Pakistanis develop a bomb without any interference. The new German government just elected the foreign minister is from the Green Party, and apparently they're going to take a position advocating NATO issue a no first strike of nuclear weapons declaration. And that, if I understand it correctly, that isn't just a declaration if anybody gets serious about that. It's also about what weaponry you have, because certain weaponry really is designed for first strike. So then you have to start seriously looking at, like, ICBMs are first strike weapons. There's no, a second strike doesn't mean much. Where is Canada on this issue of no first strike? Do you know?
I think that they've been opposed to some of those discussions within NATO historically. I don't know where the position is now. I know that the German government has talked about some sort of, I forget the exact terminology, but essentially observer status within the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And I believe the new Norwegian government has also is going to attend as an observer, and that's the Germans following suit is kind of viewed as starting to potential snowball within NATO around not support for the TPNW, but some level of kind of interest in it. And thus far, the Canadian government has been completely hostile to any movements on that front.
Now, it's a well-known, laughable secret that Israel has nuclear weapons. Everyone knows Israel has nuclear weapons. Everyone knows Israel has not signed the non-proliferation agreement. When I say everyone, it's practically acknowledged. And Jimmy Carter, former president, came out, I guess, the first senior American to say so, after he was president, said that Israel has nuclear weapons. But there's been attempts to get Israel to actually sign international accords on weapons, and they refuse. But where's Canada been on that?
Well, the Harper government isolated Canada against most of the world in a vote in 2010, 2011 around a conference to discuss making the Middle East nuclear weapons free zone. They voted against a couple different initiatives that went in that direction. So the Canadian government has been I don't believe there's been any new effort on that front during the current government, the Trudeau government, but the Harper government was quite explicitly hostile, and that got a little bit of attention at the time. So yeah, the Canadian government is definitely kind of follows along with the U.S. on Israel, and when we talk about Iran, right? The flip side to this is the Canadian government says it's all concerned with Iran's nuclear weapons program, and so the best way to, or one of the best ways to ensure that Iran doesn't acquire nuclear weapons is to have a nuclear weapons free zone in the Middle East that's taken seriously and applied, overseen rigorously. But the obstacle to that, of course, is Israel's nuclear weapons, and also the U.S. That sends its naval and submarines and whatever that have nuclear weapons into the region. So the Canadian government, when you see the Canadian government go on about concern around Iran's potential nuclear weapons, which the Iranian government has said it doesn't want to require, and has shown an openness to the idea of a nuclear weapons-free Middle East, as have many countries in the region. It's quite a hypocritical position, and Canada just goes along with Israel's nuclear weapons program and power.
Yeah, you write in the book that in 2012 there was a resolution at the UN calling on Israel's weapons to be brought under the International Atomic Energy Agency, and there were only 6 countries that voted against it. Of course, Canada was one of them. You talked about during the Cuban Missile Crisis the break in the chain of command, where essentially the Canadian military taking its orders from Washington. But also, I guess it's in the 60s, you write that Canadian forces were actually negotiating to get nuclear weapons, and the civilian leadership didn't even know.
Yeah, well, there's all kinds of coordination between Canadian military and U.S. military around nuclear weapons, and they basically, Canadian military leaders want to try to move towards something towards more of like a fait accompli before bringing in the political leadership. But there was divisions within between external affairs and the military over nuclear weapons, where external affairs didn't want nuclear weapons, but the military wanted them. And also, as mentioned a bit, the military was there were Canadian fighter jets stationed in Europe that all they had was a nuclear weapon. I think and so they the Canadian military has been quite supportive of the idea of acquiring nuclear weapons, and they understand that their the political echelon is ambivalent or hostile to those efforts, and they wanted Canadians trained after World War II. There was all kinds of Canadian military officials that were part of U.S. Testing, and the Canadian military throughout that whole period wanted to ensure that they had the knowledge and technical capacities to potentially acquire Canadian made nuclear weapons.
Okay, so we're going to pick this up in another segment. We're going to talk, first of all, I have a question, which will start the answer in the next segment, which is, why didn't the Canadian political elites go along with all the nuclear weaponization when they seem so willing to go on with most of what else goes on in U.S. foreign policy? So please join us for that. And then we're going to talk about the broader relationship between the Canadian military industrial complex and the American one. But for now, thanks very much for joining us. Thanks, Yves.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on theAnalysis.news. Again, please don't forget the donate button. It's near the end of the year. I know some people are thinking about giving money at the end of the year, or they look at their taxes and all the money they made on the stock exchange, or I don't know how many of our viewers can afford stock. I have no idea. But anyway, $5 helps, 500 helps, $1, whatever you can do. 5,000 helps even more. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching.